Good afternoon. Do we need this? Yes, you do. I need this for the camera. Hello. Welcome to the Whaling Museum. It's a real privilege to introduce these two in just a moment, but I first of all want to pay tribute to the Come the Farthest Award goes to Timothy Huia Bromley from Rotorua, New Zealand. He heard that the Wheelers were going to be speaking this afternoon, and he hopped on Air New Zealand, right? And you came straight here, so kia ora, kia ora. Tim and Janet need to just tell you a little story here before we begin. 41 years ago this month, I stumbled into an administrative office building at Sturbridge Village looking for a job as an interpreter, not quite even knowing what an interpreter did. And down the stairs came Tim Wheeler, who was the director of interpretation. And he said, we have an opening for a blacksmith and a farmer to work 3 days as a blacksmith and 2 days as a farmer on our 1830s farm. And ironically, I had been studying blacksmithing. And I said, yeah, no, I'd love that job. So for minimum wage, Tim hired me, and we drove back. I drove back and forth from Wayland, Massachusetts, an hour plus one way, back home at night. And Tim, who lived on the way, I would drop the car off at his house, and we would drive to Sturbridge together and bond as really good friends. I became coordinator of interpretation, working even more closely with Tim, and had the real pleasure of meeting Janet Woodward, now Tim's wife, for many years. How many? 30-something. And Tim, after a number of years at Sturbridge, making a huge difference, decided that he really wanted to go back to the real agrarian fields that his family had been tilling since the 1830s in a farm that's almost a couple hundred years old now. That's what we're going to be hearing about today. And this is a fascinating story of the difference that Tim and Janet have made, and their family have made on that farm over many years. I thought it would be very interesting to you. Before I begin, though, I need to tell you, too, that Tim and Janet still continue their huge love of history. And Tim just, in fact, minutes ago, finished a book on Henry Clay and just gave me this quote from the book, The Essential American Story of Henry Clay. Clay loved to travel. He confessed, as if in a reverie, that if there were two places in the country he wanted to see more than any other, it would be Nantucket Island and the eastern shore of Virginia. Because in those isolated locales, one could observe the perfectly preserved manners and customs of old Europe as they existed from the days of the earliest immigrants. I never knew that about Clay, but that's fascinating. And he never did get here, by the way, after all. But thanks for coming, Tim and Janet, and thanks for continuing your interest in history. It's been a real pleasure having you here. I think you're really going to enjoy meeting them. So please welcome Tim Wheeler.
It's green. That's a good sign, right, Brianne? Thank you, Bill. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting us. I haven't been back to the island for 50 years, and Janet had never been here, so it's been fun to spend the last day and a half wandering around, getting to know the place. Bill last night suggested that he owed me money because he had never shared in the gas that I used in driving him back and forth to Sturbridge, but his memory's clouded because there were a number of days when Bill actually drove. He had an old Volkswagen Beetle, and I distinctly remember being on the Mass Pike with the windshield completely glazed over with just a little bit of the windshield free of ice so we could see, and wondering whether we were ever going to make it to Sturbridge that day, and finally saying, we can't stay on the Mass Pike anymore, and we got off at a maintenance exit, just abandoned ship, and wended our way back over to the village. So, yeah, you drove some of the time, so don't lose sleep. So we knew Bill at Sturbridge. Janet and I worked at Sturbridge. I'd gone to Sturbridge in the 70s because farming in New England at that time didn't show a lot of promise, and so it seemed to make more sense to look at historical agriculture. So I went to work on the farm at the village for a minimum wage, $1.75 an hour, and then gradually got different jobs. And by the 80s, it appeared as though the possibility of farming in New England showed promise again, though. So as a result, Bill had left. Janet, who we worked with at Sturbridge, had left to go back to school at UVA, and I said, well, there's no point in hanging around. So I left in 81 and went back to our family farm because it started to show some possibility of the new growth in agriculture and the interest in local foods and stuff like that. So we got married in 85, and we have 2 sons, James and Nate, who live on the farm with us, working part-time there. And Janet had grown up on a farm in Connecticut, so she had some experience as to what she was getting into. So I don't think it frightened her too much, the notion that she might be hanging out with a farmer. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the history of the farm and then talk about what's going on in New England agriculture in general and give you some ideas about some of the things that farmers are concerned about throughout the Commonwealth. So the farm's in Berlin, Mass. Berlin's small. It's about 3,000 people, and it's 35 miles from Boston and 15 miles from Worcester on the intersection of Interstate 495 and 290. So it's an ideal spot to be located because you've got a tremendous volume of individuals living in the area that are interested in buying agricultural products. And we open from the early part of May until Christmas, so we're a seasonal operation. We're a conventional farm, we're not organic, and we also rely entirely on local employees. So we hire a lot of high school kids and college kids, and we've got a few old timers that come in and pick blueberries for us in the blueberry season. But generally, it's a seasonal force. And this is the farmhouse that stands there today that we've lived in for 7 generations. The stand. The main body of the stand, this part right here that you can see, was an old post office, and it was down the street. My father was postmaster there. The family owned the building. He ran a store and a post office. And we moved that to its current location here in this slide 20 years ago as the farm program grew. And then since then, we've made these other additions that you see. So it's one of about 7,500 farms that are in Massachusetts today. So there's a good number of farms in Mass. In fact, the number of farms in Mass has grown by 1% during the last agricultural census, the number of farms and the amount of farmland. So that's a good positive sign. And about the other good positive sign in our mind is that about 32% of the farms in the Commonwealth now are operated by women. So it's an expanding field for women, and there's a lot of young farmers that are beginning to get involved in it again now, too. Unfortunately, only 5% of those 7,500 farms gross more than $250,000 in a year. So although there's a lot of farms, there's only, there's really less than 400 that are grossing more than $250,000. So with the inputs that are necessary, it's a field that it's hard to make a living at still. And we hope that the future will make some changes in that. We live in Worcester County, and Worcester County nationally is 6th in the nation in per capita ag sales. So of all the counties in the country, Worcester is 6th. So we live in a very special place, and we have an opportunity to sell directly to the public, and they're keenly interested in coming to farms like ours and buying product from us. This is the picture of the farmhouse in 1782. It was built, this is a picture of the farmhouse in 1882, but it was built about 100 years earlier than this. And the farm came into our family in the 1830s when my great-great-great-grandfather, who was living in Boylston, Mass., just next door to Berlin, his wife had passed away. He had 2 young teenage children. And he married the minister's daughter in Berlin, moved to town, and bought this farm. And so it's been in our family now for 7 generations. And his son, Christopher, who's here in uniform, was the one who managed the farm after his father passed. And he married a lady from the next town over, Marlboro, about 2 miles away, named Cordelia Bigelow. She also grew up on a farm, and she moved over, and they had 4 children. He was born in 1815, so he was in his 40s during the Civil War, but he decided that he needed to sign up, and he went. He missed Antietam by a day. He was at Fredericksburg. He was at Vicksburg. He became ill, and then he wasn't able to recover, and he died in Illinois in September of '63. So from that point on, she manages the farm until her sons are a little older and able to help her out. And they practiced primarily a lot of mixed agriculture. When you think about those early farms, they're not sustenance necessarily, but they really don't have a lot of cash crops. This is a picture of Cordelia off the porch with her daughter Ellen, and they also owned a small store on the same site that our stand came from. And she managed that with her sons, and she lived until 1903. This is a picture of the barns in the property. This portion of the barn that you see back here is what we'd call a double English barn. It was built in the 18th century, and it was similar in age to the farmhouse. And then when the Hastings family came, they enlarged the barn and built this portion that you see here. But it was a typical New England farm, about 100 acres, probably a third in woodlot, a third in pasture, a third in crops. And the crops would have been things like rye and corn, potatoes, and then mixed vegetables. And for livestock, they probably would have had probably 7 or 8 cattle for dairy, for butter and cheese. They'd have a couple horses, maybe for light work, several yoke of oxen to do most of the heavy work, and then swine, some dunghill fowls, some sheep, but a sustainable approach. But after C.S.'s death, Christopher's death, when Arthur begins to manage the farm more, he's the middle son, and he married a woman from the village that had moved down to live with her uncle. She was from New Hampshire, and she'd started to teach school in the local schoolhouse. She lived a couple doors down from the family, and he married her. And together they ran the farm and made it a more commercial operation. They began to experiment with things like asparagus and grapes in particular. And this is a picture of the area out behind the barn, looking up on the hill with someone driving cows in for evening milking. So Arthur, in this picture, is with my father, Willard, his grandson. And my father remembers Arthur always being around the barn and the fields. And you can see, here's a picture of Arthur in his older years off shingling the roof of the ice house with the main barn off in the background. He lived to be 95. He served as a state legislator for a little while, but just really loved the opportunity to expand the notion of what we were growing and make it a more commercial operation. Arthur and his wife Emma had one child, and that was a girl. Her name was Florence. She went to Smith for 3 years but never graduated, and then came back to the farm. And in the early 20th century, she married a boy from across the street named Sidney. So all these people tended to marry people fairly close to home. She managed the farm after her father's death. So again, we have a woman that's running the farm operation, because Sidney and his father, seated here with my father, were in the lumber business. And they, in the village of South Berlin, the village that we live in, had run a lumber yard and a sawmill for over 100 years, from the 1850s to the 1950s. And so Sidney focused on that, and he left Florence to the business of working on the farm. And she developed the dairy herd, worked hard at developing a golden Guernsey herd back in the 40s, along with my father as he grew older. And then my father, who was a postmaster and ran this small store, was also active in the dairy business until the 60s, when it became impractical to try to do dairy unless you really wanted to expand your operation. With the need to install bulk milk tanks and invest a lot of capital. A lot of farmers in New England jumped out of the dairy business, and he did as well. This is my father and my mother. She grew up about a mile from the farm on another farm, and they were married in 1947. And together they ran this store, and he was postmaster, and then they ran the farm and had the dairy business. And then when he sold the cows, he jumped into the hay business because there was still a lot of folks around with horses, and we could raise hay and sell that. So I grew up not as much exposed to dairy, but working with the production of hay. And at that point, it seemed more probable that life made more sense working at Sturbridge Village than it did on the farm. So that's why I headed off there in the early 70s. My father began to get excited about asparagus and strawberries as the 70s ended, and he retired from the post office. And so as I watched that happen, I thought, well, this makes sense. Well, maybe I'll go back and farm with the family. So that's why I left Sturbridge in 81. And this is our family today. So Janet on the lower right there, and then my brother Richard, who works primarily with the greenhouses in bed and plants and annuals. And my father, our two sons, James and Nate, and they, as I said, work part-time. So one is working on a lot of the advertising and some of the webpage stuff like that. And Nate works more on the bookkeeping and things like of that nature. So now I'll talk a little bit about the farmer's year that we go through as we're progressing season to season. Just like you, in January, you sit down with your seed catalogs and begin to page through trying to decide what flowers or what vegetables you're going to eliminate. And that's what we do in January. We sit down with seed catalogs from about a dozen seed houses and look for new varieties that make sense, and get rid of some of the old varieties that didn't pan out the last year. And there's always innovation in the development of new qualities that seeds can bring to a crop. So it's always important to go through those. So we do that in January. And then this is a picture we took a couple days ago to give you an idea how much snow is still on the ground at home. That last storm brought quite a bit, and we're behind schedule a little bit. We've got 2 acres of blueberries on our farm, and so March is devoted, whenever the weather's good enough, to pruning blueberries. And there's our little pruning crew down in the blueberries on, that was Tuesday. So we've got 2 acres of blueberries. It's one of our primary crops. The nice thing about blueberries is that it's easy for people to pick, and people understand its health benefits now more than they ever have. So, they're really excited about the possibility of coming out with their families to have a little entertainment and get a good, healthy crop to eat as well. We do mostly pick your own, and we do a little retail at the stand. And what we're doing in pruning is we're just trying to get out the dead wood, open up the center of the plant so you get some airflow through so you can fight some of the fungal diseases that bother blueberries, and top it off so it doesn't get so tall that people can't reach it to pick. And it takes us generally 5 or 6 weeks to prune the 2 acres, working on a part-time basis, because there are other jobs that we're also involved in. One of those jobs is uncovering strawberries. We grow about 2 acres of strawberries. So in March, usually, if the weather's good, this year it's not going to happen because they're still covered with snow. But normally we'd be going through and taking the straw off that we'd put on in the fall to protect the crop from the winter. We peel that straw away and then expose the leaves to the sun, and then the plants rejuvenate really quickly. They green up very, very fast. Because from the end of March, when you think about it, it's only 8 weeks to strawberry season when we're starting to pick. So it's getting the cover off is important. Otherwise, the plants don't get established and get the vigor they need to produce a crop in June. One of the other March activities is going into the asparagus fields. We grow about 1 acre of asparagus, and it's a nice seasonal crop because it's a perennial. It comes back year after year. It doesn't take a tremendous amount of maintenance. But it needs to be maintained, and you get all this fern growth from the year before, so we burn that off, get rid of a lot of weed seeds, and clean up the beds so it's easier to to get into the work that we need to do. This is one of the pictures of, we have about 8 greenhouses. So this particular greenhouse is used for starting a lot of transplants like tomatoes and peppers and some of those crops that are very tender but need to be started early, otherwise you won't get much of a crop to pick before the latter part of July, which we really want to get most of these crops available sooner than that. In this particular case, what we're burning in this house is shelled corn rather than, we have a pellet stove essentially, a pellet furnace. But in this hopper here is 500 pounds of shelled corn. So the University of Massachusetts a few years ago realized that as dairy farmers stopped dairying, they still had land and the knowledge and the equipment to produce corn. And so what they did is they encouraged these dairy farmers in Massachusetts to produce corn to be shelled and then used as a fuel. And so there's a number of greenhouses throughout the state now that are burning shelled corn rather than wood pellets or propane or oil. And we've been doing this now for about a dozen years, and it's a great opportunity for us. It's a picture of the burn pot. So the corn is just brought in and it burns like any normal wood pellet stove would. But the benefit is that it's carbon neutral. So the amount of carbon that's produced through the burning of the corn is equivalent to the amount of carbon that's consumed in the growing of the corn. And it's grown in Massachusetts, so it's environmentally friendly that way. And it helps support that base of agricultural, those farmers that were dairy farmers that haven't had an opportunity to continue on in the dairy business as that has become more problematic. The larger greenhouses that we've got, we use primarily for production of bedding plants and flowers, and the aim is really to be able to have a lot of these crops ready for the opening of our sales greenhouse in the early part of May. So we create a lot of planters, cemetery boxes, cemetery baskets, and hanging baskets and things like that. This is a picture of my brother putting a lot of those together. And by the latter part of April, you end up with a house that's full of a lot of bloom, and you've got a lot of material that's ready to go into the sales greenhouse for the opening part of the season. In the fields at that point, we've started to plant. In this case, we're planting strawberries. In order to maintain about 1.5 acres of strawberries in production, we plant about 3,000 plants a year. So we buy transplants. This machine drops them into the ground. It takes us, we can plant about 1,000 plants an hour. And as a result, we can maintain that 1.5 acres of production. So we plant this year, we'll start to pick next year, and we'll pick for 2 or 3 more years. So generally speaking, we can hold on to a planting for 3 years. Sometimes if we're lucky, 4. Then disease begins to build up in the soil and other types of pests, and we rotate out of that land into another parcel. And the same thing happens with asparagus. We grow about 1 acre of asparagus, and each year we plant about 1,000 crowns. The crown is basically this root with a growing point. And what we've done in this picture is we put in this trench, usually about 8-10 inches deep, put a little phosphorus in the bottom of the trench, cover that over, and then the crown is laid into the bottom of the trench. That's covered over by about 1 inch of soil. And then as the shoot emerges from the crown, we continue to pull the soil in from these sides every 10 or 15 days, and that keeps the weeds down. And the shoot continues to emerge, and so by the latter part of July, you've got a fairly well-established root that's thrown out several different shoots, and that begins to build up to the point where in the following year we can start to cut. It used to be that asparagus, you'd leave for 3 or 4 years before you'd start the initial cutting, but now with these new hybrids, we can go in and we'll cut for 2 weeks the first year and 3 weeks the next, and we add a week a year up to the point where we get to about 6 weeks of harvest time. We're fortunate in that we're on an old lake bed. When the last glacier period ended and the glacier receded, there was a lake Assabet that was formed over the land that we're on. And so it's a lot of light sandy loams, and plowing is a pleasure. You don't hardly hit rocks at all. So it's an easy time to be out in the field. And we're plowing usually from the first part of April, if we can get in the ground, until the middle of July when we finish planting some of the last crops that we grow. Of course, nutrient management and soil maintenance are key factors in the success of any crop. And one of the things that we've done in the last dozen years is apply a tremendous amount of compost. Our organic matter in our soils was in 2.5–3% range, which doesn't have a lot of the qualities that plants really need. And the healthier the soil, of course, the healthier the plant, and the more able that plant is to fight disease and pests. So our objective is always to try to benefit the soil as much as we can. So we were lucky that a landscaper in the area was looking for a site to make compost on. And so on our old gravel pit, he was producing a tremendous amount of compost, and we got a percentage of that on an annual basis. And then we applied that to one portion of the farm on a rotating basis. So we've been able to increase that organic matter from 2.5 or 3 up to 5 and 6% now, because this compost is probably about 30% organic matter. So it's a strong complement, and it fits into a program that we call Integrated Pest Management or Integrated Crop Management, ICM or IPM, in which we're really trying to develop the soils so they're at their maximum, and they're able to grow a healthier crop, and as a result, the plants are far more resistant. We've got a couple greenhouses that we call them high tunnels. They're passive. There's no heat. In this particular case, these sidewalls that you see here, we can just roll up that plastic. And so when the house begins to heat up, we roll them up and cool it down. When it gets too cool, we drop the plastic and heat it up. And in this case, we plant directly into the ground. So we can start tomatoes in this house 2 to 3 weeks earlier than we can outdoors, and we can maintain tomatoes in here all the way into October, sometimes even November. And because we're planting directly into the ground, and because we control the rainfall that hits the plants, leaf wetness can be reduced significantly in this house. And as a result, a lot of the diseases, the fungal diseases that attack leaf tissue, are reduced quite a bit. This program was part of a USDA program that allowed a lot of farmers in New England to pick up these high tunnels at a reduced cost, because USDA, I think, really recognized that season extension and the ability to more passively control disease was really going to be an important factor in the survival of a lot of farms in Massachusetts. This is a picture of my mother and father a couple years ago getting the Sales greenhouse ready for opening day in April, 1st of May. So as we get toward that latter part of April, everything begins to really speed up, and we get ready for all sorts of crops to come in. One of the first field crops, of course, is asparagus. So, as I said, we got about an acre of asparagus, and these hybrids have really made it possible for the asparagus we plant now to fight a lot of the fungal disease that depress the asparagus business. Most farms that were raising asparagus in Massachusetts prior to World War II really weren't able to do much with it after World War II because of anthracnose and some other diseases. So the new hybrids have made it possible for there to be a resurgence of growth. And so what we do on our farm is when a stalk gets to be about 8 to 10 inches tall, we'll go through and we cut it. And on a hot night, you can grow 6 or 8 inches of asparagus overnight. So you'll go out the next morning and you'll have asparagus that's, far taller than you really want to harvest, but you've got to, because it's just going to fan out into it's going to form its leaves and fern out. So we go through and we cut with a pair of pruning shears like you see here, and we leave small piles in the field, and then those are gathered up into trays, and those are taken back to the stand. And when we get to the stand, we wash them off. Now in this picture, what you see here on this table this is a buncher that Arthur, my great-grandfather, used. And this building over here that my father's sitting in front of is the asparagus house that Arthur built in 1887, because asparagus was such an important crop to the farm at that point. And my father's sitting on the wash tank that they built in order to wash off the asparagus. So what we do is you take an asparagus out of these trays, you put it in these bunches, and then you've got a foot lever that closes the clamp and generates about 1.25 pound, 1.5 pound bunch. And then once those are made up into bunches, we tie them with raffia, the same way that Arthur and my grandmother Florence did. And then we cut those off, and the majority are sold at the stand. And once in a while, if we get a hot stretch where we're producing more asparagus, then we can move directly ourselves, and we'll find there's a little store in a nearby town that can take a lot of our extra product. This is corn planting. Corn, again, is one of the major crops on the farm. We grow about 7 acres of corn, which we plant in 7 different plantings. We start usually around the 23rd or 4th of April, and we plant corn all the way to the 7th or 8th of July. And we plant about 5 varieties or so each time. And as a result of those varieties coming to fruition at different dates, we end up with a schedule that allows us to pick all the way from the middle of July into October. So each one of these varieties just continually rolls in through the season. And we grow a white variety and a yellow and several bicolors, because the interest of our customer base is sometimes to look for some of those variations that you can't often find in the grocery store. By mid-May, the blueberries are starting to bloom. We've taken tissue samples in the year before. We hire, as part of our IPM program, our Integrated Pest Management Program, we hire a scout, and he comes to the farm on a weekly basis through the growing season. And when he comes, he's looking for disease and pests, but he also will take samples of tissue from strawberries and blueberries in particular, and then those are sent to a diagnostic lab at the University of Massachusetts, and they then make recommendations about what it is we should be using for fertilizer in the following year. And it's during this period of bloom that we're putting out that fertilizer, special formulations of 777 for blueberries or Sopromag and urea, depending on what their analysis has told us we need to do. So by the latter part of May, you're really into a position where you've got tremendous bloom and the fruit is starting to size up, and it's getting kind of exciting. Meanwhile, back in the fields, you've got summer squash, as you see in this picture in the upper part, that's beginning to get ready to flower. Lettuce is starting to size up. So this is all going to coincide, hopefully, with the arrival of strawberries. And then in the foreground, we've got some annual flowers that we've started in the greenhouse that we've transplanted into the field. And you see here there's this black plastic. So we put down about 1.5 miles of black plastic on an annual basis to help grow crops. Several benefits. One is that it warms up the root zone of the plant. That black plastic absorbs a lot of heat. It limits the weed growth around the base of the plant as a result of not allowing any of those seeds to germinate. And then it also helps to maintain a lot of the soil moisture. So instead of getting a lot of that evaporation that you'd get off the soil surface from the sun, we can keep a lot of the moisture there right in the root zone. And the drip lines that we put in the field that allow us to do drip irrigation are running right under that plastic. So all the water that we do put on the field is held and protected. We do use, as I said, we're a conventional farm, we're not an organic farm, so our goal is always with this IPM program to reduce the amount of pesticides and herbicides we use. We use an herbicide on strawberries and sweet corn and on asparagus, but that's about it. Most of the time, cultivation is through a cultivator like this one, a rolling cultivator, or manually with hose in our hands. And this machine's fairly versatile. We can cultivate, as you see here, we're cultivating broccoli. We can raise the beds for strawberries. We can go through a young planting of peas or winter squash or pumpkins and quickly eliminate a lot of the weed pressure without having to use any chemical spray at all. One of the other problems with May, and I expect this year it's probably going to be quite a problem, is that you end up with frosts not a lot of the nights, but enough of the nights. So as the strawberries are in bloom, you've got to find some way to protect them. So just as they do in Florida, where you've seen, they're applying irrigation water onto the orange groves, we do the same thing in the strawberry fields. And so when the temperature gets to about 34, we'll start the pumps, and then we run water all night long until the sun comes out and melts, in most cases, the ice that is formed. So you'll get ice that's 1/4 inch thick, surrounds the blossom and the plant, and as a result, maintains the temperature right around 32. The air temperature can continue to drop down into the mid-20s, but the plant is maintained and its tissue is maintained right at that freezing point. And it doesn't freeze, and then when the ice melts, you end up with a perfectly good blossom. And wherever the irrigation water doesn't reach, you go and start looking at blossoms, and all the centers are black instead of yellow, the way you want them to be. So we've been doing that now for 35 years, and it's always nice in the morning to go out in the field and realize that it worked again. Lettuce at that point is beginning to size up and get ready for sale. This is romaine, of course. And then the corn that we've been planting is starting to get well beyond knee-high by the middle part of June. And then in the strawberry fields, we've started to do pick your own. So we grow, right now, probably 6 varieties of strawberries. And so it's several acres, like I said before. And most of our sales are through pick your own. We've been doing this now for 30 years or so, and we've got a good customer base that knows that they need to start thinking about strawberries when the month of June shows up. The irrigation pipe that I showed you that we use for frost protection, we also leave in the field during the picking season because, again, just like asparagus getting overheated and growing too fast, strawberries can get so much heat that they'll scald and burn. And so we leave this irrigation pipe in the field in order to be able to turn it on and cool off the crop once we get a tremendous amount of heat in some of those June days. And in the right-hand side here, we've got one of our pickers. We hire a lot of college students and high school kids, and they come back year after year and then bring their younger brothers and sisters or some of their friends. So we've had a good tradition of kids that have grown up on the farm and learned all our little habits. So June, lots of people in the strawberry field and a lot of our own help out there as well. And we encourage young kids to pick. Some farms sort of say, well, we really don't want a lot of kids running around. But in our case, it's clear to us that unless these kids get exposed to farming when they're young and develop an interest in it, they're not going to be pickers when they get older either. So the sustenance of our business really depends on getting young kids out, and it's always fun to see them all the glow in their eye when they find that biggest berry that rivals anything else that anyone in the family picked. And of course, the goal is really to end up with a nice, healthy strawberry crop. The 6 varieties that we grow come in, like so many of the other things we do, in different stages. So we can start picking strawberries in the first part of June, and generally we can pick to the 4th of July. That's our hope anyway. And then the high school kids that work for us, when they're picking, most of that goes to the stand. If we end up with great picking weather, we can pick a little for some of the stores in the area. And then berries that you see in the blue tubs here that are sort of second quality, we separate those out and they get turned into jam. Soon after we got married, Janet started working on the jam making business, and so we've been making jam now for 35 years, and as a result, we've got about 10 varieties of jam in our listing. We do blueberries and raspberries and the strawberries, so customers are always looking for an opportunity to pick up jam as gifts, and we do gift boxes of jam in the wintertime for sale at Christmas. And then as a way to thank our customers, we do this summer social during the summer solstice, the strawberry social. And Janet's been helping with that now for a number of years. It's a good way to give back to the customers that come to the farm. So we give them a hay ride out to the fields. They can pick strawberries into the evening towards sunset, and we give them strawberry shortcake. And usually we have some live music, and it's just a way of giving people a chance to know that we appreciate their coming. Summer squash, peas, beets, lettuce, all those crops begin to come in during strawberry season. So instead of just being a one-dimensional operation, we've got that whole range of vegetables that are available, and the bed and plants are still available in the greenhouse. So June's a good month for us. The revenue begins to pick up dramatically in June, and it's always a fun time to be around the farm. Out in the fields in June, as you see here, the tomatoes are beginning to green up, so you're beginning to get some size. And then here, off to the side, we've stopped picking asparagus by that point, and the fern is starting to grow. So asparagus, like I said, we're only picking for 6 weeks. So generally, we stop picking asparagus as we start to do strawberries. And then that fern starts to grow, and it'll grow all season, and that helps develop that root system so it's got the vigor that it needs in the following season to produce a nice asparagus crop. One of the other things that Janet did soon after we got married was she had an interest in cut flowers, and so we started to plant a lot of flowers in the field, and now we do a lot of pick-your-own flowers. So not only do these go into the stand for sale as bouquets, but we can give a customer a pair of scissors, and they can go out in the field and pick their own. So that goes along quite nicely with the strawberry pick-your-own and the blueberry pick-your-own that we do. So people can pick flowers for their desk at work, or if there's sometimes people come and say, well, my wedding's in 2 weeks, can I come back with friends and pick flowers for my wedding? And lots of times people will be doing that. And then some of the varieties are varieties that dry well. So for instance, the Gomphrena in the back here dries well, and the Celosia dries well. So we'll harvest those and hang those in the stand, dry them, and then in the fall we can do dried arrangements that we can sell to customers in the fall when the growing season outside is slowed down quite a bit. In flowers, on our farm, we sell flowers that people pick their own, or even in the stand that we've picked by the pound. So instead of counting out stems, people go out, they pick, they bring up what they've got, we throw it on the scale, and we just charge them by the pound. It makes it a quick way to get people in and out of the stand. Traditionally on our farm, we'd been watering with overhead irrigation for the first 20 years or so after I came back to the farm. But that was always problematic because you'd end up in a situation where you just wouldn't have enough water in the pond that we have, which is fed basically with runoff from the fields. We usually figure we had 5 or 6 weeks of water in the pond. So we could go through a good drought, but a drought like last year was overwhelming. And so we've gradually tried to shift away from that. Most of the overhead irrigation was pumped through pipes like these here, 2, 3, 4-inch pipes. And sometimes we'd be putting pipe out almost 2,000 feet from the source. So it was quite a distance, and a lot of work because you're always moving pipe around into new fields, and you're always trying to cross over pipe and having to take it apart in order to get equipment through. So it's not an ideal way to try to supply water to a crop. And an emitter like this one here that you see, this Rainbird, this puts out about 7 gallons of water per minute. So in a season where we're fighting frost, let's say, and we're watering 2 acres of land, and we're going to water for 10 hours, we might pump 100,000 gallons of water in that night. So we can deplete our water supply fairly quickly with all this tremendous amount of water. So that's why, with the help of NRCS, the Natural Resources and Conservation Service that the federal government runs, we've been converting a number of fields over to drip irrigation. And as a result, we can reduce our water usage by 65 or 70%. And the ideal thing about this, as you can see on the slide, is that the water's going directly to the root zone. You can put nutrients right through the drip system, so you can apply fertilizer in a staged way when the plant needs it. You're not watering the aisles where a lot of the weeds are trying to grow, so you're got an opportunity to suppress weed production. And the drip lines can go under the black plastic, like I showed you in that earlier slide of the annual flowers. So we can use it under tomatoes or peppers. And as a result, we're not watering the plant, and just as in the high tunnel, the less water we put on the plant, the less fungal disease there is, and the less need to use fungicides and all that to prevent disease buildup. So ideally, you end up with a corn crop that looks like this if you get enough water from Mother Nature and you're able to put water on through your irrigation system. And this is corn that's just about ready to harvest. That tassel, the silk that you see here is starting to brown up. In years where you don't get enough water, you end up like this. So this is last summer. And it was clear to us early on in June that we weren't going to have enough water. And for some reason, we just said, this is not going to break. And so we stopped watering a couple acres of corn, and it just, went backwards and dried up. So again, the conversion over to drip means I've got more water in the pond that I can put on corn, and that assures us of an opportunity to keep corn not looking like this and looking like the slide in the picture of the previous slide. Now, also in this picture, you see these these are what we call, these are traps that we're using as part of the IPM program. So there's a pheromone lure in that trap, and in this case, we're trying to catch corn borers. We also use traps like this to catch corn earworm and fall armyworm. And my scout that comes on a weekly basis goes into the fields, he puts up the traps, he baits them with the pheromone. The male moths are attracted, they're trapped in there, and then based on the work that UMass and the other land-grant colleges in New England have been doing, we know how many moths we need to see in the course of a week to create enough economic damage for us to have to do something. So if he finds 5 moths, he says, you're fine, don't do anything. But if I find 40 moths in the week, males, then I need to take action. Now, with corn borer, again, because of the work that UMass has done and some of these other colleges, we know that when the corn borer lays its eggs and those little caterpillars hatch, they're in a vulnerable stage as they leave the egg and go into the corn. And we can buy on a 3x5 index card the eggs of a trichogamma wasp. And that wasp is a little tiny, minute thing. You'd hardly be able to see them. And they end up laying eggs into those little caterpillars. So if our timing is right, we buy the wasps based on the count that we're getting in the field of male moths. We put the cards out, the eggs hatch, they attack those emerging caterpillars, and I don't have to spray. And it's always a pleasure not to have to suit up and get on the tractor and go out and spray. So programs like that UMass are running are exceptional. And particularly in New England, where so many farmers are working directly with the consumer, we're selling to people that are asking us questions about, what are you doing in your fields? What are you spraying? It's nice to be able to say, we're using biological controls and mechanical controls whenever we possibly can. Another example, this is a cucumber beetle. Of course, they do a lot of eating, which you see here, which is damaging. But the other thing they do is they transfer the bacteria of some of the viruses, for instance, that impact and bring disease into the plant. And so what we've been able to do is we know that this particular beetle enjoys blue Hubbard squash more than they do pumpkins. So I can plant blue Hubbard squash plants around the perimeter of my pumpkin field, and when they emerge from the outlying weeds, they end up landing on those blue Hubbards first. They eat those, and I come along and just spray the blue Hubbards. And I don't have to spray the whole field of pumpkins. And it's worked quite successfully. And again, that's UMass and those other land-grant colleges and the research they're doing. In this case, it's imported cabbage worm. In this case, it's imported cabbage worm. And in this particular picture, we're going to use a BT, a bacillus, a bacteria. And what we can do with this is it's a dipel. It's an organic spray. The insect ingests it, and before you know it, they can't eat and they die, and you control it organically. And then the Scout also puts out traps like this that you see here. This is a trap that captures a tarnished plant bug. And by counting the number of pests on this particular trap, we know when we reach that economic threshold. And in this case, we don't have any biological control, so we end up coming through and having to spray like we are here in this particular picture. What we've got here is tomatoes that are finally beginning to produce. So this is as we get into that month of August. And then in the stand, we're beginning to see a lot of those winter squashes as you begin to come into the fall part of the season. Of course, we were a dairy farm, so we had a lot of the equipment that we needed to do dairy hay production. And so there's a picture of my father driving an old 1950s tractor. We're still producing about 2,000 bales of hay a year. And most of that is sold to local equestrians. So we're able to load up a pickup truck like this and make deliveries directly to some of the farms in the area. As I said, we've always hired a lot of local high school kids, and we try to encourage a lot of their individual talents. So in this particular case, this young girl was really good at art, and we always had her do a lot of our signage. She went to the Rhode Island School of Design eventually, and now she's in New York as a graphic artist. But we really benefited from the work that she did, and she did the logo that we use now that was in the first slide. Because as strawberries end, we end up looking at a crop like raspberries. We grow a couple different types of raspberries, a summer barren variety, which you see here, and then there's fall varieties. The summers, what we do is we end up going through and cutting out all the cane that produced this year and then allowing the cane that grew this year to fruit next year. And the fall varieties, we cut down completely, and as a result, they end up bearing in the latter part of August into October, sometimes all the way to Columbus Day. And as a result, we've got raspberries from the first part of July all the way into October, so almost 100 days worth of raspberries. And then blueberry season is, for us, pretty important. As I said, it's our major crop. We've got 2 acres of blueberries. Bird protection is important, so we end up covering blueberries with 2 acres of net. And then before you know it, you've got all these kids racing down to the field in the month of August to grab a hold of as many blueberries as they can. And when you're looking at blueberries, you're really after a crop that's going to size up and look like this. Most of these fruit get to the point where they're almost as big as a quarter. We've attempted some new ventures recently, one of which is the farm-to-table dinner. A lot of farms do that. I think Bartlett does it here. In a lot of ways, Bartlett's are similar to us, a multi-generational farm. They're much larger than we are, but they're involved in a lot of the same types of activities. But a farm-to-table dinner has given us an opportunity to, well, we can entertain about 150 guests over the course of a couple nights that we do the farm-to-table. And we work with a local caterer. And Janet's been involved recently in trying to promote the sale at our farm of a lot of value-added products that farmers in the area are producing. So meat and cheeses, spaghetti sauce, things like that. And usually what we do at these farm-to-table dinners is we invite a farmer or two, one of these young farmers, to come and give them a chance to talk to the audience that we've got. And then after the dinner, we go back to the sales greenhouse, which is empty by then, and we have dessert and local entertainment, and people hang around till 9 or 10 o'clock. It's a nice opportunity, again, to give back to the community. In September, it's back to the fields. We're harvesting squash. We grow about 9 varieties. And then also in September, it's time to start harvesting pumpkins. There's a lot of interest in a lot of these new ornamental squashes, and as a result, pumpkin sales have grown quite a bit over the last few years. And at this point, we're in a stage where we've plowed down some of the crops, like corn, and now we're interested in making sure that the soil is going to be brought up to its maximum potential. So we apply a lot of lime in the month of September to bring the pH up into the 6.5–7% range, so it'll be ready for the next year. And we're in the fields at that point, harvesting corn stalks for sale at the stand. The stand begins to flesh out with a lot of those fall crops. And in the stand, we've got a lot of the value-added materials. This is a picture of a trebuchet with young men around the farm. There's always been an interest in medieval warfare, so they and their friends built this trebuchet a few years ago, and then, of course, you said, well, what are we going to do with it? Well, the idea came up that it could be used as a fundraiser for the local historical society. So we give the pumpkins to the historical society, they sell them, the funds go to their benefit, and then the pumpkins are launched usually about 350 feet at a target, and if your pumpkin hits the target, you get a little share of the proceeds from the sale of the pumpkins on that day. And in the fields, we've put on the cover crops, rye, in this case also some hairy vetch, which is a legume, so it fixes nitrogen, helps to prevent a lot of nitrogen leaching into the groundwater. And then some of that rye we use as straw to cover over, in this case, this is garlic, but we also put the straw onto the strawberry fields, usually about 4 or 5 tons of straw on an annual basis. So the cover crop with the hairy vetch in it is plowed under in the next season, and that nitrogen is made available to the crop for the next year. And by the time we get to December, we don't grow Christmas trees or wreaths, but what we do is we buy them in from Quebec, and then along with the materials that we've got in the stand, the value-added products, we can end up able to, we do cemetery boxes and wreaths, decorated wreaths, and we do a lot of natural ornaments that you see here, like on this tree, made out of a lot of natural materials from the farm and dried flowers and stuff. And before you know it, the snow starts to arrive and you cover it over. This was 3 years ago when we constantly had to uncover greenhouses and to try to prevent them from being collapsed by the weight of the snow. And as January rolls around, we're right back to the beginning, thinking about, what we're going to order for seeds again, and we start to sit down with the seed catalogs once again. So thank you very much. That's the year. And if you've got questions, Janet will answer them.
So if anyone has a question, raise your hand. We have a little bit of time for a few questions. We got a question here.
Do you have a farm apiary?
We've got 3 hives right now, and then we have a couple people that we let put bees on our property. They're important, of course, for pollination on strawberries in particular. Winter squash, pumpkins benefit significantly from, having bees around. With the use of the chemicals, again, the IPM program really dictates that we've got to be very careful. So we're careful about what we spray and when we spray it. But we've been able to keep bees on the farm now for 35 years or so.
Do we have any other questions? Got one back here.
This is a loaded
I don't have
question.
a question. I don't have a hard one because I don't want to stump you, Tim. But I'm just so mindful of the work that goes in to you producing food for people and how particularly gorgeous it is. It just was so beautiful. I want to be a farmer.
No, you don't. Yes.
Just to follow up on that question, I saw it just beautiful. It just looked awesome. Like, let's just go hang out on the farm. You got nice looking tractors. There was one picture with some dried corn. There must be, what are some of the big obstacles that you encounter that you have to overcome?
Well, it's certainly drought. We've always found that we never had enough water, and we've always been in the situation where we're trying to decide what to water and what not to water. So that's the big problem. And new diseases like spot spotted wing Drosophila, a new fruit fly. In 2008, it arrived on the West Coast from Asia. It swept across the country in 4 years. So by 2012, it was here. And a lot of New England farmers gave up raspberries as a result, some of our neighbors. We've been fighting with that, and we ended up, our IPM program wouldn't work. So we ended up having to spray every 5 or 6 days to defend ourselves against this pest, because she's got this saw blade on her hindquarters, and she can lay her eggs into ripening raspberries and blueberries. So where most fruit flies bothered overripe fruit, she was attacking ripening fruit. So customers would pick ripening fruit, it looked beautiful, but that egg was in there ready to hatch. And when they got it home, they'd start to say, what's the matter with my raspberries? So we're working with UMass this year. We're part of a trial to come up with some new IPM strategies to solve that problem. So it's disease, it's water, it's pests like that. It's tricky. We're fortunate, though, because as I said, we're in a part of Massachusetts that is tremendously supportive of farms. We run a CSA program now where CSA, community supported agriculture, so people buy a share essentially and then are able to pick up product through the course of the season. And we've had real good support from that, as a lot of farms have in Massachusetts, that's a good sign too.
I'm going to wrap things up right now. I want to say thank you again. So one final round of applause, a huge thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Next week, we will have John Copenhaver here talking about his short film, Everyone Has a Story. So please do check back in next week for that food for thought. Thank you all for coming.